Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the end of a week, but not quite the end of Tommy's week. We have one more show next week with Carl McDermott about the show at Rangers Yeomanry. And it was interesting. I was just chatting with our guest, Ben Mayne, about the early days of World War II TV. We did a couple of live streams about Operation Charmwood, the subject of today's show. And now we've kind of moved on and it's a bit slicker, a bit more professional now. But I'm really looking forward to getting cracking today. So I'll bring Ben in. You know who Ben is. He's a guide for Ledger. He's a historian. And Charmwood is one of his little babies, I suppose, now. So good evening, Ben. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Paul. How are you?
Very well. So we were just chatting there. Charmwood, as we'll discover, is kind of still remains the overlooked operation in Normandy, and is when it is written about, it's usually critical of slowness and failure to get this, and you've walked those battlefields many times now. What is it other than the fact that your hotel when you come over with groups is right on the battlefield, but what is it that draws you to it?
I'd probably say, as many people know, the relationship that I had with Alan King, the veteran, is probably the driving point. Hearing his story, his most significant day, you could say, during Operation Charmwood, 8th of July. And then the spin-off from that, starting to research not just around the village of Cams, Galman, but then the wider perspective, the British and Canadian participation. And I always see, you just kind of alluded to it then, that with Charmwood, we have the pre-Charmwood of you could say, the criticism towards the British of not taking Caen. But then the second part to it is always the criticism of the RAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force, bombing Caen and destroying it. But we miss that middle bit of what is really crucial, is the northern half of Caen is finally liberated a month on from the landings on the 6th. And then very quickly Operation Goodwood that definitely overshadows Charmwood. And I just think there's this gap, I always say, gap in the market where we could go back to Charmwood and explore some of potentially myths, misconceptions around the operation itself.
And a lot of it is just about the definition of what the hell we mean when we say Caen anyway. You know, when I was doing a battlefield tour and say, you Brits didn't get Caen D-Day, I would say, what do you mean by that? Specifically, what do you mean getting the first boots into the outskirts of Caen? Because that is Caen. Do you mean the city centre, or do you mean the high ground beyond Caen? Because Caen is a metropole as much as being a city. It's an area. I mean, depending on even if you ask people living in Normandy today what they define as Caen, they would give you slightly different answers. Do you include all the villages within 5 and 6 miles of it as part of Caen? Are they somewhere else? So even just defining what Caen is, I think, is complicated. But anyway, we're digressing into definitions. I'm going to hand it straight over to you. We've got 4 different sets of slides today, folks. We'll do questions as we go along, but I'm going to hand over to Ben to learn about the operations of July 44.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. So before we start to get into Operation Charmwood and what that was effectively all about, I'll first of all apologise to our Canadian friends that are with us this evening. With it being Tommy's week, I've split the battle into 2. So the concentration tonight is on the British aspect to Charmwood. That is not to take away the huge contribution by the Canadians over to the northwest and western side of Caen that form part of this, crucial with what they do, mirroring the British on route into Caen from a different direction. We will cover small, tiny aspects just to bring in the Canadians at the start, but the main focus is going to be on the British 3rd Infantry Division and the British 59th Infantry Division, just to clarify on those points. We could do a whole another hour on the Canadian aspect on another day as well. So before I say, as we get into the actual Operation Charmwood itself, one thing that cropped up last night with Andy's PowerPoint, he mentioned towards the end about tea, and tea is obviously a very British thing, and he mentioned Stephen Ambrose saying that the British didn't take Caen on D-Day because they were too busy drinking tea, and it doesn't happen for some time because effectively he thinks we're sitting around drinking tea, which is far from the case. And the map that we've got here, I just wanted to outline that pre-Battle of Normandy, General Montgomery, who's in charge of the land-ground forces for the Operation Overlord, his battle plan, or how he envisages the Battle of Normandy to take place. And you can see there Caen towards the centre top that we'll focus in on shortly. But the outer periphery of this plan, you can see to the south, the Americans pushing out from the Omaha, the Cotentin Peninsula area south towards Nantes, Angers, D plus 60, so 60 days to get down to there. Over to the eastern side, push towards Paris, we're looking at D plus 90. And when you then strip this plan back and the realities of what actually does happen and what happens with the Germans, their reaction, we'll see that shortly. Really, the Battle of Normandy is over after 75 days. So the talk of the British, the Canadians being slow to take Caen, we're effectively well ahead of Montgomery's battle plan of being beyond here by D plus 90. We're crossing the River Seine on the early September. Le Havre liberated 12th of September, for example. So we're well ahead of what the battle plan really was. So straight away, we've got these misconceptions that the whole plan is taking too much time, that from the British side, it's too slow, when the reality wasn't that at all. To now start to focus it in towards the Operation Charmwood, Normandy and Caen. Throughout this presentation, I've tried to use maps from the archives. One example here, archive photography, the maps showing defensive positions from at the time, the 1950s ING mapping that you'll see as well. So shortly after the battle, and it gives you a perspective of how even 5 years, 6 years on after the battle, the landscape, there was still things to be seen at that time. And then we'll mix it in with Google images as well to try and build up that picture and get you onto the ground as much as we can. But following the landing 6th of June, very quickly, the Germans start to mobilise and push their panzer units in towards the area of Caen. You can see there the quite a heavy concentration of, starting off to the eastern side, 21st Panzer Division. As you work your way round, the 12th SS Panzer Division, 1st SS Panzer Division, 9th Panzer Division, the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr, all around Caen and to the east or west of it. So that heavy concentration, the German reacting to the Allied landings, throwing their armour into that bridgehead, and effectively falling into Montgomery's plans really to draw the Germans into the Caen area. The knock-on effect of that, if the British Canadians can hold the German panzer units back around that area, hopefully that would have given the Americans an easier breakout from the Omaha, Utah area, the Cotentin Peninsula, going down beyond Saint-Lô, heading down into Brittany. And effectively, that's what does happen on the ground. It becomes a huge battle of attrition all around Caen, and there are operations prior to Charmwood, which is the 8th of July, that do take place and are unsuccessful. The one there's Operation Epsom to the west of Caen around Hill 112. And again, this battle of attrition, sometimes referred to as the Verdun of Normandy, Second World War, with just how many men are being killed, wounded, or missing from the actions all around that particular area. So that map just highlights the concentration of how it was sitting 30th of June as we go towards the week of Operation Charmwood. To then focus that in around how the lie of the land was around the 7th of July. So as we said at the start, over to the western side, we can just see there Caen, that mass as we see it today of the city. Over to the western side, you have the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division sitting ready to push on towards Carpiquet Airfield, Chiron, out towards that direction. But the focus for this, the British 59th Infantry Division, I always class that as they're sitting in the centre area of the operation, around the area of Mathieu, Villers-le-Buisson, ready to push down that centre area into Caen. And then over to the other, or on their left flank, you'd say the eastern side, is the British 3rd Infantry Division, sitting on the ridgeline overlooking towards Le Bessay. And they were in the area of Beeville themselves. The German side of business, you had the 21st Panzer Division, more sitting by then out towards the eastern side of the River Orne, Caen Canal. But they've been backfilled by the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division that were occupying the Le Bessay ridge line that you can see there. The German units of kind of marked with those red markings. And then as you work your way round to the northwest corner of Caen, this is where you would have been encountering the 12th SS Panzer Division, so the Hitler Juden, the Hitler Youth. And rather than Germans all sitting in Caen or on the very periphery of Caen, they were occupying all these villages to the northern and northwest corner of Caen, creating what I refer to as strong hedgehog defensive positions. So that is their main line of resistance. And that had pretty much been set by the 7th of June. So whether it was the Canadians or the British sitting around this area of Caen, it'd become a stalemate, and they had been observing each other for roughly around a month before Operation Charmwood gets underway. And one of the British veterans who was interviewed, British 3rd Infantry Division, sitting in the area of Beeville, looking towards the Le Bessay ridge line, he basically said that we'd just sat in opposite valleys from each other, and we'd just been constantly mortaring each other for nearly a month. And then when Operation Charmwood gets underway, he says he's quite happy that finally we're on the move and we're going to start pushing forwards towards Caen, which they do. Just quickly to focus on the two infantry divisions. So the insignia on the left-hand side, the British 3rd Infantry Division, had seen action Dunkirk 1940, withdrawn, Monty's Ironsiders that had come back to the UK, rest, refitted, retraining, ready, and then they're going to be put into action on D-Day, landing on Sword Beach on the 6th of June and successfully clearing and pushing inland, only roughly around those 6-7 kilometres before holding the ridgeline, looking down over Caen. When you look through the plans for Operation Overlord, I've never personally come across any orders that said Caen must be taken on D-Day. And also it doesn't say that it should be taken on D+1. It's more alluding to the fact that they should be in a position to try and take Caen by D+1. But because of circumstances, the German reaction, that does not become possible. And there's probably an argument you could put as well, even if they did get beyond, if they'd taken Caen and got to the high ground to the southern side that Paul mentioned at the start, would it have really changed what happened around that area? And I personally don't think so. I think we still would have held the line, drawing the German panzer units in. It just means that we're fighting south of Caen rather to the north of Caen. The insignia to our right-hand side, as you look, is that of the 59th Staffordshire Division, Infantry Division. So they had been formed in the 30s. They were a TA, territorial infantry unit. They'd only one battalion from that infantry division had seen action in the Battle of France 1940 and were withdrawn back to the UK, where they continued to train men to get their numbers up, ready for potentially being used later on in the war. They serve on home defensive duty up around the Humber area. They end up going to Northern Ireland again on defensive duties there. But in 1943, head back across to England, where they're starting to conduct their amphibious training, basically in preparation for Operation Overlord. They eventually come off the landing craft onto via Sword Beach, Juno, and then make their way into the area north of Caen. So they're landing around the 28th of June, literally a week before Operation Charmwood gets underway. So they're not given a huge amount of time to acclimatise to the situation. And bearing in mind, many of these men had never seen combat before. The majority had gone through the training. So they are what we'd refer to, similar to American divisions, they're pretty green There will be people within the ranks that have seen combat, but they're a pretty green division in particular, who are going to be tasked with punching that hole through the German northern area of Caen, those defence. So what I've kind of done with this part is just to outline Operation Charmwood and what the objective is going to be. It is a combined arms operation, so that means that the Air Force, the Navy and the Army are going to be used for this. We're working alongside the thoroughly tried, tested, competent Canadians, their 3rd Infantry Division that is out on the western side. So as you look at the map here, Baron, Orty, Carpiquet area, that would be the route of advance in for the Canadians. The centre at the top from the Cams area, you have the British 59th Infantry Division that would be pushing down the main axis, what I sometimes refer to as the Éperon Road down into Caen, and then the British 3rd Infantry Division over to the other side on their left flank in the Lebisse area, using 2 main routes of axis down, one tracking pretty much mirroring the route of the canal by road, and then another one that cuts straight over a ridge line and into Caen that way. The operation itself is going to involve 155,000 men on the ground. So this is pretty significant, and this is where I always think that when you start to look at the numbers of those involved, whether it's the Army, Air Force, Navy, this is pretty significant, and artillery as well, and we'll get to that a bit later on. So ground troops alone, 155,000 men that are going to make that push towards Caen. The operation would start on the 8th of July at 4:20 in the morning and is timed over 4 specific phases, which hopefully all 3 infantry divisions would be meeting those schedules as they push through the outer defensive perimeters around Caen and then on into Caen city centre itself. And we'll come to the final objective in a second for that. From the air, the RAF part and Royal Canadian Air Force, 467 Lancasters and Halifaxes are going to form part of a pre-bombardment. And sometimes another factor that's overlooked, the US Air Force is also going to be involved in Charmwood. Not until 7 o'clock in the morning, but you were looking in the region of 190 B-26 Marauders that were tasked to come along and re-bomb what the Halifaxes and Lancasters had done before. So we have got American participation in Charmwood as well. 5 naval ships out at sea, the most notable one, HMS Rodney, I think 15-inch guns on her, that will be called in alongside the other 4 naval ships, destroyers, to target specific areas. All this area of Caen is well within range of that naval firepower as well. And then backing up the infantry on the ground and the armoured divisions, you have a roughly in the region of around 400 artillery pieces, probably the majority being 25-pounders from the British Canadians that are going to be used to bring down firepower and rolling barrages to assist the infantry on the ground. The end goal for both the Canadians and the British is to get into Caen city centre, then to the north and then just south, and hold the northern banks of the River Orne. And what I've marked in the solid blue line towards the upper right-hand corner, it's actually the canal area. So once the British 3rd Infantry Division were in place, they would then need to push on beyond that marina that you can see where the dotted line is, to then take up the northern area of the bank along the river. So that is the objective phase line. Kilometre wise on the ground, you're probably looking at a 10-kilometre advance from the jump off point into that river line, roughly around that sort of distance. I'll use the old famous quote from the film Bridge Too Far, but what about the Germans? So, yeah, we started off with where their panzer units were all positioned around Caen, and they had their own plans at the time. And the reality of their plans ever coming to fruition were few and far between. The reality of what they potentially would have wanted to do was not a reality. So around the time of Epsom and then Charnwood, Herbert Meyer, the 12th SS, and this is taken from his book, one of his sketch maps, around their plan to actually carry out a large counterattack against the British and Canadians. They wanted to throw 2 Panzer Corps at the British and the Canadians to drive up towards Juno Beach, and then they'd split. You'd have 3 Panzer units turning right towards Sword Beach and then looping in around the rear or the northern area of Caen into the British. And then once they'd advanced towards the Juno Beach area, then turning off westwards, rolling up Juno Beach, then onto Omaha area with 3 other panzer divisions. But the reality of them having the resources, the firepower to do that, it's not a reality at all for the Germans to put that counter-attack in. Hence, that stalemate is there. When you look at the memoirs of people such as Kurt Meyer, he's arguing very early on. He realises that the British, the Canadians are going to mount these big operations, and eventually the Germans were going to be forced back. And he's arguing prior to Charmwood even about the Germans dropping back to the southern bank of the River Orne and making their defensive stand from there rather than waiting for what does eventually unfold.
And just to jump in a bit, Ben, because the frustration must have been there on both sides, because we're squarely up until July in that attritional phase where, as you said, Epsom has had mixed success. The American Fifth Corps pushing in from Omaha has had mixed success. The push up to Cherbourg's had mixed success. So, we know that behind that there's this bringing up of all the reinforcements. Both sides are still bringing across bringing up supplies. The Allies are setting up airfields. The Germans are bringing more divisions in. But if you're a Canadian in the front line in somewhere like Villeneuve-Buisson, or you're a Brit somewhere, Hérouville area, you've just had weeks of just frustration of artillery strikes night after night, patrolling night after night. The attritional phase was where it was wearing everybody down on both sides, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's a really important point, that battle of attrition. And just before we move on, I'll finish on a point around the tanks in relation to the panzers and the armoured units from the Allied side, is that the Germans didn't have really any way of replacing the tanks that were destroyed. They can't move the vast amount of tanks that we're able to do. You swing that to the Allied side, sitting behind all our beaches, we have these vehicle parks, hundreds of tanks just sitting ready to go. And where you'd hope that an Allied tank crew, that if their tank was knocked out, they'd be able to escape within the space of a few hours, they could have another Sherman just to roll back in the next day into battle. And the Germans don't have that luxury. Once their tanks are gone, it's pretty much they're gone. They're cannibalizing what they can, stripping down other tanks to repair others. So that battle of attrition that the Germans are drawn into is really depleting what they have. And we can sustain that, where I'd say the Germans probably couldn't at that period and through the rest of the war as well. Operation Windsor for the Canadians, it's a sub-battle to Operation Charmwood. And just to very quickly just make note of this. So the Canadians were trying to capture Carpiquet airfield that was an objective for the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division from the 6th onwards. But again, similar to the British, they're held up. They can't get through to get onto that objective. On the 4th and 5th of July, they do get into the airfield at Carpiquet, and the scenes here too taken after the battle with the Canadians posing on a pack, and then the hangar shows the devastation, the destruction that was caused at the airfield at that time. The Canadians capture and hold the northern end of the airfield, but it's not until Operation Charmwood gets underway on the 8th of July that they then are able to push through, and they do eventually capture the southern half of the airfield here at Carpiquet. The IGM mapping from roughly around 1950, you can see the craters still littering all around the area 5-6 years on, and the airfield would eventually be rebuilt. It wasn't used by the Luftwaffe at the time, and it was beyond use, well within Allied bombing range, etc. So it didn't feature with German fighters taking off on D-Day or afterwards. But the Canadians do eventually capture Carpiquet 8th of July and then push on through into the village of Carpiquet itself. The pre-bombardment, which at the start I said about, probably is more notable and discussed more than the actual Battle of Charmwood itself. So as part of the pre-bombardment, 7th of July, around 9 o'clock in the evening, 467 Royal Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force, Lancasters and Halifaxes are going to come in and bomb two particular areas over the northern areas of Caen. And from the archive mapping, we can see the plan of where these two bombing areas are. And hopefully that's visible enough on your screen. So the two particular areas that are going to be targeted were designated Target Area A and Target Area B. The Air Force itself, you were looking at, they were going to drop in the region of around 2,500 tons of bombs, of which 2/3 were around 1,000-pound high explosive bombs as well. A lot of them were time delayed. The whole purpose of the reason for this pre-bombardment was effectively to stop the Germans being able to withdraw from all those villages that were screening off the north of Caen. It stops any reinforcements going out to those defensive villages. It should, well, if successful, it should sever the German lines of communications and also limit any supplies, whether that's ammunition, being brought up to the front as well. You can see Area A, which is just off to the what would be the northwest corner of Caen, which is basically out in the fields. And then Area B, that is that smaller one just to the right with the solid red line around it. That is just to the north of the city centre of Caen as well. And it's close to the main, one of the main roads you can see dissecting straight through the middle of Area A into that area. I've overlaid it onto the IGM mapping from around 1950, just to give you an idea of the what Caen looked like back then, especially the suburbs, the residential areas. And you can quite visibly see here that Area A to the left-hand side is effectively in the fields, not really around any residential areas. But Area B, that centre one, is very close to the populated city centre.
Yep.
And there could be implications for that. And the RAF, Royal Canadian Air Force, were fully aware of that. And in their briefings, when you read through some of the memoirs, what was recorded by them, they were basically told that, look, you can't drop your bomb short because you've got 155,000 of our men sitting on that front line ready to go on that night of the 7th. But then also you need to be mindful you can't overrun your bombing area because you're literally going to be bombing into the populated area of Caen. Estimates of around 20,000 civilians still in Caen at that time, even though the battle had been raging on their doorstep for a month now. People did not want to leave their homes, especially the elderly, that they were adamant they were not going to be moved from there. They hadn't left when the Germans had come. They certainly weren't going to leave when the Allies were here. But we'll hear later on the implications of what happens with that particular bombing phase. With the blue circles that you can see on the map now, so Area A off to the left, Area B is that centre one. You can see just how much now the urban sprawl has gone from that 1950s all the way out up towards Epron and out towards those villages. And those red circles that are on the map effectively shows the main areas of German resistance, whether it was the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division or the 12th SS, the Panzer Grenadier regiments around those villages. That is where they were. So it's quite clear that the RAF weren't going to bomb onto those areas where the main resistance was. It was all around trying to cut communications, limit the chances, opportunities, withdrawal or reinforcement. And I'd definitely say it was not intended to bomb Caen or carpet bomb it to destroy the infrastructure of the city as well. And again, I think over time there's been some misconceptions around that as well.
Definitely, yeah. Right, we're next slides, aren't we now? So that's the first. So there we are.
Yes. So we've mentioned the RAF bombing, the pre-bombardment. To move on to the naval side of the business. So HMS Rodney, as we can see here, with those 9 16-inch guns, sorry, not 15-inch. So huge amount of firepower that can be brought down onto the specific targets around Caen that are going to help hopefully the infantry and clear the way for when they start to move forward. One of those particular areas of or a key target area was Point 64 that sits along that Epron Road that we can see marked here. The 1950s map, different to how we see it today, but this is kind of the straddle borderline between the 59th Infantry Division and the 3rd Infantry Division. So as you look to the right, the 3rd, 59th in the area of the main road as they advance south towards Caen from this area. Point 64, one of the main reasons in the war diaries of why it was hit by HMS Rodney with those 16-inch shells was it was believed it was quite an extensive German communication area. And it was crucial for them that linked up probably the Lebisse ridgeline towards these outer villages in the northwest west area. But as with many of these locations, this is a really accessible battlefield or operation just to get out and walk around on foot, and you can get into many of these locations still today. That was, as I say, one of the main targets for HMS Rodney that in the early hours of the morning is being hit by those guns out at sea to bring down the firepower supporting the infantry, paving the way, hopefully, to give them an easier task through. We mentioned around 400 artillery pieces that are going to take part in Operation Charmwood. And another thing that always gets me, and I do need to do a little bit more research just to try and corroborate if this is a true, I'd say, factor, but it's said that the artillery bombardment, the pre-bombardment for Operation Charmwood, is the largest concentration of artillery firepower since Africa in 1942. So another reason that I think it's just overlooked and lost within the battle as it goes along. So when you start to look through the war diaries as well on how many shells may have been fired by these guns, one of the Canadian war diaries for one of their artillery batteries says that each gun had used 300 rounds by the end of the operation on the 8th of July. And when you then look and try and work out the figures, well, if we've got 400 guns roughly using 300 rounds apiece, you're in the region of 120,000 shells being put down from late evening till the end of play on the 8th of July. So a huge amount of ordnance being put down onto those German positions and beyond as well. H hour set for 4:20 in the morning, and this is where the British, the Canadians, start to move in and sticking with the British to the northern area. The largest circle down that Epron Road, then the 3rd Infantry Division from the area of the golf course that you can see there, those main routes in down towards the centre of Caen, and the objective of that final phase line on the northern bank of the river. 27 infantry battalions are taking part in the operation and 9 armoured regiments alone. And when you start to look at the armoured side of it, probably in the region of around 400 Sherman tanks are being put across this front as well. And this IWM photo here, the Army Film Photography Unit were on the ground with the battle as it's taking place, and we're lucky to have quite a lot of film footage in that front line as the battle is being undertaken. And here, one of the tanks from the 33rd Armoured Brigade, probably in the area of Beeville, moving forward from their jump-off point to head down towards the Lebisse ridgeline itself. We've got the intelligence maps that show the area of the German defences. They're marked in red. And the main focus here is that Lebisse ridgeline that you can see in the centre, the wooded area. What you can't really gauge from this is that just to the north at Beeville, there is this valley area. It drops down from Beeville into the flat low ground and then rises up again into Lebisse, what is probably the final ridge before it then drops into Caen itself. And you can see why the Germans chose using the cover of the woods all around Lebisse to position themselves there and to stop the British in their tracks, using those two dark black lines, those main routes of advance towards Caen. Just of note, on the 6th of June, the King's Shropshire Light Infantry do get up to the area of Lebisse Wood, the furthest advance of anyone from Sword Beach on the 6th of June, but they're very isolated at that point, and they then turn back to head back to the Perrier's Ridge line because there's just nothing that they can do isolated alone, no armoured support. But if you do go to Lebisse, you may find their memorial at the side of the road commemorating where they get to on the 6th. So this view is just at the bottom of the depression. Beeville would be behind me at this point, and I'm looking towards that Lebisse ridgeline, the Lebisse Wood, up on the horizon there. The D60 then goes up and climbs up to the ridgeline there. And this view here, we'd be looking straight across at the positions of the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division that were all positioned, at least 3 companies, all in that hedge line, all the trees, all at the very centre of the picture that we can see there. That car just down the road to the right, intelligence that there's pillbox positions, concrete emplacements down there as well. So the Germans had got a month to prep these positions ready for any advance that the British may take. We've got here another advance looking at the IGN, those 2 main routes. If we just ignore the Eperon Road side for a minute. So the British 3rd Infantry Division, as soon as they can clear Lebisse, are to push down into Caen city centre itself. Again, the units that are going to be doing this, the 2nd Royal Ulster Rifles, the 2nd King's Shropshire Light Infantry, they're pushing through to try and get there as quickly as possible. If they can get into Caen on the 8th, that's great. If not, the battle will continue into the 9th as well. And the route, once they're clear of Lebisse, is pretty much across the open fields before they then start to encounter the urban area of Caen itself. With Lebisse Wood being captured, what stood out to me as we do our research, as Paul well knows, little nuggets of information that come up in war diaries that grasp you and make you think, that's really interesting. It sends you off in a different route, or trying to find something that comes up. The 1st Norfolk Regiment, they are part of the 59th Stafford Division, but they do eventually on the 9th of July get moved across to the fighting. Although Lebisse Wood wasn't fully cleared, the 3rd Infantry Division progressed down into Caen. It's on the 9th that the Norfolks return back to where they'd been on the 7th of June. Sorry, I've said they're the 59th. They're not. They're the 3rd Infantry Division. So they've been fighting up at Lebisse on the 7th, and 2 of their officers had gone missing. It was noted within the war diary. When the Norfolks get back up to Lebisse Wood on the 9th of July, they actually locate those 2 officers that had been missing since the 7th of June. And they're able to identify both of those officers. They make reference in the war diary that they're really surprised even the Germans hadn't buried them. They were just left out within the wooded area. And although the war diary didn't name them, it was quite straightforward, as we do as historians, researchers, to then identify the two officers, lieutenants that had been missing since the 7th of June, who were actually identified, and both now have marked burials, one in Douvres-Deliverance Cemetery and the other at Ronville. And that was one thing that stood out to me, because I'm sure it was a horrific sight for the Norfolks to find those men, or what remained of them, but I'm sure it probably brought some comfort to those men that they'd finally brought two of their friends, their men home, and that they were able to give them the dignified burial for their families to come and visit them in years to come as well. The Lebisse ridgeline as well, quite a, I'd say not a famous photo, but a photo that's used quite often is this of a Mark IV Panzer that had been dug in, hauled down along the Lebisse ridgeline. I'd say it's off to the western side of the golf course, looking probably towards the area of Chateau Lalonde, around them, parallel to the Éperon Road. It'd been disabled. Some of the other photos, if you ever see them, you can see that it's clearly lost its left-hand track. And the Germans, rather than, it goes back to that point of not being able to replace them, it can still fire its main armament. So they've dug it in to use it as a static anti-tank weapon, effectively. So straight away, any tanks moving forward through this area would be encountering these or this Mark IV that have been knocked out and dug in on that ridge line. I've never been able to identify exactly where it is, and I'd say with the electric pylons in the back, it's definitely around that Éperon Road area where there were some of the smaller villages, hamlets as well. And now a lot of this area now has been redeveloped, and we'll come back to that towards the end of the presentation as well. The British 3rd Infantry Division, we said on the 8th, get beyond Lebisse Wood, and then they start to make their way down on the 9th of July into Caen itself. The Army Film Photography Unit in amongst, embedded with those men, capturing these images. And I always think that these two men, as they go along that road, probably quite tentative, wondering, is there anyone left in these buildings? Have they been cleared successfully? So quite probably cautious footsteps. To go back to the pre-bombardment, though, when you read through the war diaries, whether it's the British or Canadians, they all make reference of what a grand show it was on the night of the 7th, with the amount of firepower that was brought down from the artillery, from the Navy, and that aerial pre-bombardment. I'm sure they were pretty confident, and the question was being asked, well, who could have survived the amount of ordnance that had been thrown down at the Germans? So no doubt very confident as they push on towards Caen as well. And they do start to encounter the French civilians. We mentioned Caen city centre alone, probably upwards of around 20,000 inhabitants still there. But the villages all around the periphery, those people are still in there as well. And very quickly on the 8th of July, the war diaries allude to the fact that they are, as the infantry pushes forward, they're being greeted by these civilians that now are homeless, displaced. They're refugees, as they refer to them within the war diary. So if you put that back to a British perspective behind that front line, not only are you trying to conduct the battle, the operation that's underway, you're having to deal with your wounded that are being brought back from the front line. You're dealing with German prisoners of war. You then also have to deal with these civilians. You need to move them out of harm's way. And then the big question is, their homes have been destroyed. Where are you going to then house and look after these civilians? Because the Allies had a responsibility to do that. You just couldn't leave them out in the street with nowhere to go. They need shelter, they need food, water, etc. And this was one of the photographs that captured the French civilians. I think it's to the one man here on the left, and we'll see more of the civilians a bit later on. And along the Éperon Road, we've got another Mark IV Panzer. It's lost its right track here. I'm not sure on the circumstance of how this was knocked out, whether it was actively moving around, engaging, manoeuvring, but very quickly, just the sheer firepower that the Allies had got, the British around that area, they'd be able to deal that with the M10 Achilles, for example, that would be in amongst the Sherman tanks as they moved forward. To start to move it across now to the centre area for the 59th Staffordshire Division and their advance, you can see here we've gone back to that mapping, the original mapping that shows the German defensive positions around the area of those villages. And this is where more so, Libby say the ridge line is mainly the defensive line, but here to the north and then northwest for the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division, you've got these, what I refer to as hedgehog defensive positions. The Germans had occupied the villages. They've created these quite, in some cases, I'd say quite formidable defensive positions that offer 360 fields of fire. So we'll hear shortly on how, as the British progress through those areas, of how and the implications of what that would come to. Bearing in mind as well that the British 3rd Infantry Division have been on the ground in Normandy for a month now. They were acclimatized. They were used to the opposition that they're up against. The Staffordshire Division had been on the ground for just over a week, and it wasn't going to be as easy or as straightforward for them to try and replicate what the British 3rd Infantry had been doing at that time as well.
And just to give you a break for your voice for a second, is my great uncle Cyril, who was with the 2nd Battalion Royalist Rifles. He always talked about, although they have a very clear idea about what the aims of the operation were, they had very little idea about what they were going to find in the way of, as you said, their rubble, whether there were going to be civilians in their way or not, whether they would have to clear the houses or not. That was very much left up to the company commanders, and in his case, platoon commanders, to work out. And as they worked their way down, it went. He was surprised by areas were almost completely destroyed, other areas they weren't at all, and it was very much a suck it and see as they pushed their way in that day. So you've given us a very thorough grounding of the overall aims of the operation. But if you're a small part of it, there's a huge amount of uncertainty about exactly what you're going to encounter as you move in down these roads.
Yeah, definitely. I think that point that you'd be confident your pre-bombardment has worked. Are the Germans going to have withdrawn overnight? They've got the idea and let's just get out of here. The case of that is very different. They're ready and waiting. And when you look at the likes of the 12th SS, we know for a fact they're indoctrinated. They're radicalized. They're not just going to give up and walk away from their defenses. And we'll hear of those implications for those fighting around the area of Galmanche, Saint-Contest, La Folie, with this next part as we move forward. So again, you can see here we've got the main route of advance. So the majority of this isn't sticking to the roads like the British 3rd Infantry Division. They will use the main Epron Road, which is that straight diagonal line just to the north of Caen, but the rest will then push in through the villages. And what you have to be mindful here as well is that on their right flank, they need to also be very mindful that the Canadians are coming directly into their right flank. The Canadian orders as they push through their own areas of the likes of Baron or T towards Abbey Ardennes is that they're going to have to put in pretty much a 90-degree right-hand turn to then slot into the right-hand side flank of the 59th Infantry Division as they push in towards collectively that Caen area. And the Canadians would have been around the area of Carpiquet, just below what is marked on that map, just for reference. I keep saying about these hedgehog positions, and a prime example and I always use it because I think it is a really good case study to look at, is that of Galman. You can get into these locations from Caen very easily. You can use the farmers' tracks to walk around, so you're not going in the fields in crop, etc. You can get around and really get a feel for just what the Germans had got in position here. I'd estimate probably in the region of around 200 men. So it's the 2nd Battalion of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, 12th SS, that are in the positions here. And they've had, again, a good month to fortify this little hamlet, which is only about 4 or 5 houses, properties, but they're dug in, they're well sighted, and have 360 fields of fire ready and waiting for whoever would dare to push through and make an assault, whether it's a direct or frontal assault. It doesn't really make any difference. You could come from any angle around Galman and you'd be in trouble with those positions. And just to try and make it a little bit clearer, you can see the hamlet there. We're looking south from this direction, so sitting in a north-east area looking towards Caen. For those that have been to Caen or visited the battlefield before, one of the most prominent things on the battlefield for orientation is that hospital block, and you can see that big solid lump of concrete just in the distance top right hand corner, just for orientation. You may see the red dotted line just to the upper left of the screen. That's the old railway line that leads down to Caen. We'll come back to that railway line shortly and who would be going towards the lights of Malon and Le Foley. But here at Galman, you can see the slit trenches coming from the side towards firing positions. I think they estimate there was roughly around 21 individual firing positions along. I'd estimate about 150 yards of hedge line, of which they said for every third position was a machine gun, which is pretty significant for anyone who's going to come around the left flank of Galman. Littered throughout the area, 81mm mortars. As you look towards the road, just to the middle of the screen, anti-tank ditch cutting the road, which they knew 81mm mortars embedded in there as well. And only yesterday, you're always learning. You never stop learning with this. And I was flicking through an archive file that I've had for some time, and I came across a photograph that showed I think it was possibly the North Staffs, I think it was, and they got a photograph just to the south of Galman that actually showed that there were Nebelwerfers potentially in amongst the hedge lines as well, which wasn't something I'd come across before until yesterday. So that adds even more firepower into what those SS men had around the small hamlet.
And the nature of those hedgehog defenses as well, Ben, is that the Germans have nothing to lose. They can't. They're brilliant to defend, but they're crap to retreat from. So they're going to fight to the last round, which is effectively what Hitler is ordering anyway. So you know, there's nothing to lose. It's all in. They've put all their eggs in one basket. They're going to just defend there till they're knocked out. They're tough prospects to clear.
Yeah, I think from the German perspective, definitely with that, it's just do as much damage as you can, delay, hold up as much as you can. But the British perspective, you're looking to hopefully within the space of an hour, 2 hours, clear this small hamlet and be pushing on towards Caen. So different ways of looking at it definitely brings into play the motivations, ideology from the 12th SS. As you mentioned, they've got nothing to lose. They're just going to stand and fight till the last man effectively here. And you can see that it branches out a good 400 yards beyond the hamlet towards Saint-Contest that we can see down in the distance. And this view is looking off to the western side. You can see those vast expanses of open fields that, with the attack put in by the 2nd and 6th South Staffs onto Galman, the 1st and 7th Royal Warwicks are just expected to go down the side through that expansive field that we could see there in full view. that we just mentioned, those firing positions. Every third one is potentially a machine gun, line of sight straight out into the left flank of the Royal Warwicks that were being expected to push on down towards Saint-Contest. To give you an idea as well of the positions of how they'd obviously had time to create strong, deep defences. Here is one of the photos from, I can't say it's at Galman, but it would have been replicated throughout the area, that they're well embedded, entrenched into the countryside, using all they can to put these discreet, hidden away positions. And in some cases, you hear that they're even covered over. It's once the British have passed, they pop up and then just fire into the rear of the British. Galman as well, heavily kind of surrounded by what we class as the bocage. And this photo gives you an example that was taken at Galman of the barbed wire, the entanglement that then is being put into there as well. So it's not a case of just knocking these positions out. You've got to penetrate into them as well. And no doubt they would have left gaps that the British would have gone for, and then very quickly just a machine gun trained onto it. Similar, replicated throughout different areas of the bocage as well. So it's all pre-laid, pre-planned, ready for anything that could take place. I couldn't do an Operation Charmwood presentation or talk without mentioning Alan. I'm sure many people will have heard me speak about Alan, and there he is circled there. 20 years old. He was a wireless operator loader in a Sherman tank, 1st East Riding Yeomanry, that is tasked with supporting the 2nd and 6th Staffs on the 8th of July as they move towards Galman. And in the main photo there, the field behind Alan, that is the direction of advance that the East Riding Yeomanry were going to come in at 4:20 in the morning to support the infantry as they moved on to this position. Alan's probably actually stood in the area where intelligence said there was a machine gun looking straight down the driveway that's just behind him, pointed straight down to what would potentially be a main route of advance inwards. The accounts of the East Riding Yeomanry, very quickly they arrive at Galman as the battle gets underway, and the infantry are just not there. Immediately the 2nd and 6th South Staffs pinned down. They cannot get in towards Galman. So not just Alan, but the other accounts that are available is that the tanks are there. They're in and around Galman. So this is B Squadron, roughly 20 Shermans, and they're struggling to identify any targets. And the reason for that was the smoke from the pre-bombardment, the dust clouds that were lingering around. They're being fired upon, but they can't start to pinpoint to try and help the infantry break in. One of the problems for them as well, with all this hedgerow bocage around, they don't want to get in too close initially, because we all know what would pop up. Panzerfaust, and very quickly the actual Shermans would be knocked out. So the Shermans are hanging back, and the accounts of those that were there saying that they were firing HE round, high explosive rounds, into the hedgerows, trying to just hammer those hedgerows as much as they could to knock out the fire that was coming towards them. They do eventually break into the fields just to the northern area of Galman, one of those behind Alan, as I said. And Major Platts, who was the officer in command of B Squadron, is very quickly picked off. As we know with Sherman tank commanders, usually standing proud out of the tank turret, even during battle, to get a better observation, their fields of view, to try and conduct what was happening, taking place. Platts is killed. Major Platts is killed, and then shortly afterwards, Alan's tank commander, Louis Wilkes, Corporal Wilkes, is also shot in the head and falls into the tank, and Alan starts to treat him. You can just see there, before we move on, the battle damage still to this day around the walls of the main chateau at Galman, if you ever go down, and that was what Alan was inspecting. This was probably about 7 years ago when we went back there with him and went to several prominent places. Alan and the crew withdraw. They're trying to treat Corporal Wilkes. They go round to the northern area of Cam, where there was an aid station. This field, which is opposite the cemetery today, this is where they get into there to this aid post, and very quickly the medics shake their heads. Corporal Wilkes was handed to them, and they were told that he was killed. He was dead. There was nothing more that they could do. But whenever we went back with Alan, this was always a prominent location for him. Whenever we stopped the car, even before we went into the cemetery, we'd hang back as you would, and Alan just walked off to this gate and he'd stand in reflection, looking in, recalling the 8th of July, Operation Charmwood for him. About a year later, Louis Wilkes was exhumed and reinterred in the cemetery across the road, and Alan always went back and visited Louis. And there's just a photo just to remember Louis. The left flank around trying to think, left flank, of Galman. So those open fields, the North staffs are tasked with pushing through those open fields. So here you can see their jump off line at the very top, start line, which was the old railway line that ran down into Caen. So they're using the cover of the embankment, the tree lines, to then push on down through to get, first of all, to Malon and then on to La Folie. But the problem is you can't quite see it there, just to the top left-hand corner. They're in full view of Galman as they make that advance towards Malon. And it's not until the 9th of July that they're actually successful in capturing Malon and then pushing on towards La Folie as well. And when you read through the war diaries, one of the first things that they recall on the 8th of July is that as they advanced across those fields, the battalion was being, or two particular companies were just being shot into the rear from the area of Galman because it wasn't clear. The 2nd and 6th South staffs don't clear Galman on the 8th. It's not until early on the 9th of July reinforcements are being sent in, and they actually do eventually clear and consolidate, take Galman itself, but a heavy loss to the 2nd and 6th staffs. The North staffs do, as we just said, take Malon and La Folie on the 9th of July. But on the 8th of July, St. Contest that we can see there, the 1st and 7th Royal Warwicks do successfully take that on the 8th of July, although they're taking casualties from Galman just to the north of the screen as well. I think with that archive footage, it just gives you an idea of the pre-bombardment, the craters that just littered all across this field. That would have been from the artillery, potentially some naval fire as well onto those positions. Back to the Army Film Photography Unit. So across the other side of the road, the 1st Norfolk's 3rd Infantry Division down that borderline, they are eventually going to head up towards the area of Le Bessay Ridgeline, but I'm very confident I've taken stills from the film, but this will have been of them as they pushed along that Epron Road. The Sherman tanks, 13th, 18th Hussars, so those that had landed in the first wave on D-Day are still in action in that area that they've been in for a month period. Again, the Shermans progressing, trying to get in and support the infantry as they pressed forward in that area of the Epron Road. What also captured me when you look, we've got these images from the Imperial War Museum archives. It's always worth reading what is documented or what was written on the back of the photos. And what stood out with many of the Operation Charmwood photos were that it was noted that whoever wrote them said this resembled the Battle of the Somme. It was First World War scenes. And this one kind of captures that, those long ranks of infantry pushing across the open fields, shoulder to shoulder. I've obviously put the reference numbers so people can go and research. They can watch these clips, which I do highly recommend. It's a great clip of footage of the battle well underway. But you can see the men just walking openly across the fields, and mortar fire, bursts of mortar in amongst them, just hitting the ground as they make their way towards their target. And they are successful. They get up through to the area of Le Bessay, and then would be, as we mentioned at the start, around Le Bessay Wood on the 9th of July. So this half of the Epron Road is very successful, but it's not successful for the 59th Infantry Division over to the western side of that road, who literally their first time out are pretty decimated by the end of the 3 days of the battle, and we'll cover that at the end of the presentation. But the 3rd Infantry Division, they're very successful with their advance. Likewise, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division, very quick gains, successes pushing in from that western side and mirroring basically a pincer movement from either side as the 2 3rd Infantry Divisions do that, Canadian British. They're just lacking the 59th Infantry Division that are held up successfully, you could say, by the 12th SS all around the northern area.
Brilliant stuff. Well, we'll switch slides, but we've got a couple of questions that we'll deal with before we move on, if you don't, okay? So,
yeah, go for
Gary
it.
Down is saying, were crocodiles used in the attack, and how were they employed? I would think flame would have been very helpful against the hedgehogs.
Okay, I'll be honest. In the research that I've done so far, there's no record of crocodiles that I've come across. I'm not saying there weren't any, but in any of the war diaries or even supporting the armoured brigades, there's no mention of them. But it's not to say that they weren't there. I've still got war diaries to collate and collect, so they may come up, but I've never seen any imagery of them either at this time.
First question. And the next one from Lance is, was it 1 tank battalion per infantry regiment?
I'm trying to think. No, I want to say 2 infantry battalions. Sorry. 1 tank battalion or 1 tank regiment per 2 infantry battalions. So the example would be the where we've just mentioned around Galman, 2nd and 6th Staffs, 1st Royal Warwick, supported by the 1st East Riding Yeomanry. Then you've got the Norfolks with 13th, 18th Hussars, with the KSLI over that side, for example, if that helps.
Yep, that helps. And Sean Brennan is saying, were anti-tank mines a major feature of the defence lines? Sorry if mentioned earlier, as he was late.
No problems at all, Sean. Yes. So when we started off looking at the Lebisse Ridge, the Germans had actually set minefields all in that lower depression along the road where we viewed looking up towards. But as you probably expect, overnight engineers had been going out, clearing a path ready for Operation Charmwood. But yeah, there were minefields that needed to be overcome, especially around that Lebisse Wood area that had been noted and started to be cleared by the British 3rd Infantry Division.
And one from David O'Keefe now, which is more about you when you visit the battlefields. Ben, you have walked these battlegrounds for some time now. What are your thoughts when you do?
Cool.
Bearing in mind we've still got half of the show to go, because that's a big one, isn't it? That's a big one.
Yeah, I think my mind drifts towards the veterans that I knew that were part of the battle, trying to think about what they were going through at the time. I also think to spin it from the German perspective, I think it's important to walk their areas and look at their defences and trying to think how that would feel the British Canadians coming onto their positions. So, yeah, it's thought-provoking in many different ways. And to do that also helps with my personal understanding and trying to piece things together in my mind. But, yeah, it's a really, really good question.
It is, and it's one to ponder over a pint at some point. But back to you, and we're 3/4 of the way through nearly. It's been fantastic. We're loving it.
So just to stick with the 1st and 7th Royal Warwick, so now we're around the western side of Galmanch as they pushed on towards Saint-Contest. Again, there's some great photographs. You can see here the Sherman tanks, 1st East Riding Yeomanry pushing across those open fields, so off to their left flank. And no doubt potentially that smoke that you can see in the distance is the defensive network around Galmanch as they push on towards Saint-Contest. These photos, again, whoever captioned them makes reference to scenes of the First World War with the infantry progressing across cratered land. You can see some of the craters. There are photographs of the men taking cover in there, having a break for some rations. I'm not going to say having tea, but they're in there as they progress on towards Saint-Contest that you can see just in the very distance. the church spire as they then kind of put in a left turn along the tracks and then head towards the village itself. These fields, again, you can still walk the farmers' tracks through here. And 2 years ago, I think I was there, and they did have corn in the fields that was taller than me. And you get a perspective of what's referred to as waist-high corn at the time that offers some kind of protection. The infantry there, the Warwicks, you can see probably level with their shoulders as well, just off to the right-hand side. And then a bit of today's view, although it's not on that track, they were cutting diagonally across that field. You can just see to the top part of the photo that quite distinctive church with a big circular stained glass window at the top with the apex point that makes it stand out. And I'll just flick back and forth for a little bit of then and now, but it gives you a perspective of the advance of the Warwicks towards that position. So as we bring this towards a conclusion, Caen, we've collectively, the British Canadians have broken in through those front lines of the German defences. What would greet them when they finally got into those last 3-4 kilometres towards Caen? The bombing. So we said at the start, it wasn't the task to carpet bomb Caen and the residential areas. It was the outer peripheries. But as what would happen, the lead aircraft, bomb aimers, would drop potentially too far forward, and then the follow-up aircraft, thinking that we can't drop short on the 155,000 men behind us, then try either bang on that target, the marker, or release afterwards, which meant that bomb scatter went straight into the inhabited area of Caen. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of homes, historic medieval churches, buildings, infrastructure are all hit by that bombing raid in Area B to the north of Caen. Again, that was not the intention to do that because of the implications that we'll see shortly. To give you an idea, 1950, Area A over in the Canadian area, pretty successful, that does hit mainly the fields, does its job and task that it was meant to do. But then Area B, 1950, you can see the devastation still then, 6 years on, that's still pockmarked ground from that main bombing. And then just to the centre bottom half of that photo, you can see that the residential buildings would have just been bulldozed and cleared because they were just not fit for purpose, inhabitable anymore. Those first infantry that get there around that area to the northern Caen is the British 3rd Infantry Division. And again, that First World War battlefield phrase that was captioned on the rear of this, the pockmarked landscape. You can see that man from the film photography unit looking out towards the northern area of Caen now. And you can only think that they're probably thinking this isn't good when they start to see beyond that first rows of houses the devastation that they're about to head down to into Caen. The argument that could be put forward, well, was Caen city centre itself a military target? The 12th SS headquarters was in the Abbey Dams that's there. They knew that, and that there would have been military movements throughout the town, the city. This photograph here, it's probably not obvious for some until I say, but these two Frenchmen that are out inspecting the devastation, they're actually, one of them is stood on the turret of a Mark IV Panzer. You can just see the skirt, the wheels, just to the right of the gent who stood on the ground. So there are military manoeuvres, activities being conducted by the Germans in Caen city itself. So you can see why it's, although not a direct target, not to bomb it as it was, there were military targets in the city itself being used by the Germans. The infantry, that once they get beyond the periphery and into the city centre, are greeted with scenes like this. Both British and Canadian war diaries talk about 15 feet high piles of rubble and bricks. And that means straight away the infantry are going to have to be going it alone on foot. You can't put universal carriers in to support, and there's just no way that Shermans or self-propelled Wolverines, M10 Achilles self-propelled guns are going to be going in to support at this point. So the infantry are left to slog it on foot as they make their way in, albeit on the 9th, when the British Canadians are making their way in, there's very little resistance. The Germans have withdrawn at that point. But this photograph just shows you the devastation of what is greeting the British and Canadians in the centre of Caen. The civilians that are there, probably this caption on the photograph said they were happy to have met the British and the Canadians that had come into the city. But the reality of that and the devastation has left us contradicting accounts of the feeling towards the Allies. And I'd also say that that feeling still runs strong today within the community around there. And I'm always mindful of it, walking around Caen and seeing the new Caen that's been rebuilt after the war, that the British had a part to play in destroying this medieval city, albeit not intended to do so. I've been after this book for quite a long time and finally pulled my finger out and got the book. And one of the obviously Paul's uncle on the front, will make reference to that. But the quote that's in there by the author, who was there, part of Operation Charmwood, his quote really hit home about that, not being able to even look these French people in the eye or in the face because of what they'd done, knowing what they'd done with 20,000 civilians in and around Caen. So that's where the controversy has come in around the pre-bombardment side. So I just wanted to make reference to that. People on the ground even acknowledging back then in 1944 that it didn't sit comfortably with some of the British. Caen was quickly consolidated. By the 10th of July, the defensive line is all the way on across the northern area of the river. The Canadians round that northwest corner, the British to the north. And there's an opportunity then for the British to then start to do some propaganda photos, or you could say some stage photos. A 6-pounder anti-tank gun looking straight back up the road from where the British had come. And I'm happy to say there's probably no chance that a German Panzer or self-propelled gun was ever going to come down the road at that point. But you can replicate where these photos are just all around the area of Chateau Caen if you go walk in the street. So it's not just out in the field that you can walk the battlefield, it's also in the city as well. And another quite famous photo, 2 British soldiers just in the gateway of Chateau Caen looking out towards the abbey. You can see the devastation there alone, the top half of the spire completely gone and destroyed. So lots of work would be needed. As we said, the objective was fully achieved, and by the 10th of July, the British and Canadians are starting to withdraw some of their units into rest further behind the lines, more so the British 59th Infantry Division, because they took quite a heavy beating, to say the least, around that northern area of Caen, and they end up going towards Gold Beach into a rest refit position. The Germans occupying the southern bank. There are accounts of that they're still being harassed or are harassing the British Canadians from that southern bank, mortar fire, small arms fire across, but Caen had been liberated by the 10th of July. Just to bring it to a conclusion then, with the figures around the casualties, British losses in the region of 2,623 killed or wounded. The largest proportion to any of the units that lost men was the 2nd and 6th South Staffs, 215 men killed. So that's pretty much half the battalion, you could say, are gone, and they're no longer a fit fighting unit after that battle against the Hitler-Juden at Galman. The Canadians, again, a very costly battle for them, but successful with their objective. 1,194 killed or wounded, and more notable for them, the Highland Light Infantry at Baron taking 262 casualties in their battles to take that village on the 8th and 9th of July. The just snippets of the war diaries quickly there give you that idea of just how much the bottom one for the North Staffs on the 9th of July, just showing that their officers very, very depleted, which leaves the ranks without those officers. You're needing that leadership. You need the lower ranks, the other ranks, to step up and start to conduct in the battle, bearing in mind they're green as well, so limited experience. And you can start to see why the 59th, you could say, struggled to meet their objectives under the defence, those strong defensive positions of the 12th SS. And then just at the top again, another snippet from, I think, the bottom is 2nd and 6th South Staffs, and then the North Staffs at the top. Again, just 7 officers killed, 10 wounded on the 8th of July alone in the area of Galman, which again just completely depletes their numbers and leadership. The German side withdrawing to the southern side of the River Orne, estimates of around 2,000 killed or missing. 600 prisoners of war have been captured by the British and Canadians. The figures around the 12th SS, although I take these with a pinch of salt with who's recorded them and how they were reported, it's estimated that around 489 12th SS were killed in that northwest area of Caen by the 59th Infantry Division and the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division. I'd probably say the numbers were higher than that, but we know that they underinflate when things don't go their way. So there may have been more 12th SS killed during the Battle of for Caen, Operation Charmwood. And the photograph there of German soldiers retreating through Caen on the 9th of July, probably the very last few men to get out of Caen before the British had come in, and the Canadians from their respective directions. With all of this, you cannot forget the civilians. It's a major part of this battle, and it's important to remember them as well, not just always military. And I said earlier, the French still hold remembrance services for those civilians that were killed. Estimates of 400 civilians killed, but again, I'd guess there were more than that by the end, with those that were possibly gone and never seen again under the rubble and the burning fires that would have happened around Caen. You can see again there what was once a beautiful medieval city, the northern areas around the city completely destroyed and gone. But Caen's still now to this day a lovely, beautiful place to visit, and I encourage people to go in there and take a look around. It's a lovely place to go and visit. Then just back out on the battlefield to the northern area, you can still find things from the battle to this day. And at the start, I mentioned about the development work around the area of Le Bessay and Epron, and the building works has shifted loads of huge mounds of earth. And we'd gone into the area of the King Shropshire Light Infantry, and we were just clawing through these mounds of earth, knowing that there might be something. And I'll give credit to my dad, because he actually found it sticking out the bank, but very quickly passed it on to me. And I'd like to think that this is one of the spades used by the British infantry during Operation Charmwood that we've recovered and kept as a bit of a relic and a reminder of the Battle of Operation Charmwood from the 8th to the 10th of July 1944.
Well, absolutely outstanding. And for those Ben's Twitter details in the description below, and you can book a tour with him via Ledger. There's a link to Ledger, the website, in the description below. And Colin and I are lucky to meet up with Ben every now and then when he can escape from his tour group, when he isn't when you aren't trudging the Charmwood battlefields. We do get to see you every now and then, and extraordinary stuff. And I'm glad you talked about the French side of it, because I probably told this story before, but when my great uncle leading his platoon came in, there was a particular house with civilians, and the only survivor of the family was a sort of a teenage son. He was about 17 or 18 or something, and he'd sheltered in the door frame, an internal door frame of the house, and his parents had been killed. I think his parents had been killed on June the 6th. They'd been killed a month earlier. I don't think they were killed that day. I can't remember the details. But he had, during the bombardment at the beginning of Charmwood, he had been sheltering in this doorway, and he had the one remaining decent bottle of spirits that family had. He was holding it in his arms, and he shared it with my great uncle and his men when they came down the street. And I always, that story, even as a young kid, when he told me that story, it meant something, that there's a French guy whose family have been directly killed as a result of Allied bombardment. And yet his first thought is to save a bottle of spirits to share with the liberators when they would walk in. And my great uncle found it very difficult to accept the drink, knowing that it was almost certainly, Commonwealth bombers that had killed his parents, and his house was in ruins. This poor lad, and it's an extraordinary story.
Yeah. It's thought provoking in different ways, but yeah, the realities of it. I'm sure the French or those from Caen were happy by the end to be liberated, but mixed feelings even to this day. Earlier on this year, even down in Falaise, I popped into one of the churches there, and it made reference to the German bombings of Falaise, but someone had basically got a pen and written the Allies on there as well. So it shows that the French do still consider and remember that it wasn't just the Germans that bombed the civilians, that Allies had caused casualties as well. And there's that small bit of resentment there, which I can understand with how they feel towards that.
It's not completely neat, as we keep saying on this channel. These things aren't black and white. That you can both, as a French civilian, be grateful for the liberation, but also bitter that as a result of it, your parents, your sister, your boyfriend, your girlfriend didn't come through it because of the civilian casualties. It's okay to have those two thoughts there, and of course they wanted the Third Reich gone, most of them, and they were glad to get that freedom, but it came at a cost. I mean, and we mustn't also ignore the fact that the French government, as it was in exile, was in support of the Allied plan. I mean, they were giving their agreement, if it's not an odd word to use. They were consulted. De Gaulle and others were consulted, and it was understood that the price was going to be high. Unfortunately.
I think just to quickly go back to David O'Keefe's question, it was a really good question. So if I'm walking around Caen city centre, what I'm probably thinking more than anything is that we bombed and destroyed this city, and thinking of that side of things as well. So that's probably another thought that I get walking around Caen in particular.
And yet another way of looking at it is that Caen is in many ways a modern university city, because it had to be rebuilt. Like Le Havre, it was rebuilt in a slightly different way. So it enabled that city to, in some ways, modernize. And my own stepdaughters who were educated in Caen, it's very big with Erasmus. It's very, you go to the university, it's with students from all over the world. So it's got an international feel now, Caen, which it might not have had. If it hadn't. I'm not saying that they were grateful for the bombing, but it allowed the city to develop in a different kind of way. Le Havre, it was also, which we could talk about in another future show, heavily bombed, and became a very, very architecturally fascinating city post-war, with wide boulevards and what were for the time very modern apartment buildings, the modern church there. So, out of terrible things, acorns of hope can grow, and Caen is a very different place to some of the more traditional city in Normandy because of that outward look it has, and it's a very international. Even the Peace Memorial that sits there that is incorrectly called a museum, but it's a memorial. But anyway, we're going down a rabbit hole. I'll leave it at that. But Ben, been fantastic talking to you. You've answered the questions. You've given us a fantastic presentation. We've also had requests to have you back and a Canadian to tackle the Canadian aspect, or just a Canadian, or just you. But we should definitely, for June next year, for the 80th, go into a bit more detail about the Canadian assault. I think would be good.
Yeah, more than happy to do that. And as I say, apologies to our Canadian friends that are watching. It was for Tommy's week, but we could do a whole another hour on the Canadian and as vital impact and role in this operation.
Brilliant. Well, we'll leave it there, folks. So I'm back again next week with what is ostensibly an economies show. So we're looking at the war economies and Lend-Lease and American Arsenal and that kind of thing. But there's the show at Rangers Yeomanry show in the middle of that, because it isn't, as we approach Christmas, the kind of the ordering of the shows gets a little bit muddy because people can't be available certain days. But that's essentially the theme next week, is Economies Week. But Ben, thank you for your presentation. Viewers, thank you for your great insight and questions. And I will see you all on Monday. Cheers, everybody. Have a good weekend. Bye.